The moment the forensic document examiner set the two signatures side by side under the light box and said the words, "This is not a match, not even close," I watched 51 years of my mother-in-law's carefully built authority collapse into a folding chair in a Charlotte, North Carolina law office, and for the first time since my husband died, I felt my hands stop shaking. 6 days earlier, that same woman had stood over Daniel's casket, straightened her black blazer, looked past my swollen eyes like I was a stranger renting space in her son's memory, and told me that I had until the end of the month to pack up and leave the house on Ridgewood Lane, because according to her, it had never belonged to me at all. My name is Claire Whitman, I'm 42 years old, and I live just outside Charlotte, North Carolina, in a quiet brick house with a wraparound porch that my husband Daniel and I bought together 9 years ago. If this is your first time hearing one of my stories, I want you to do something small for me before we go any further. Subscribe to Silent Revenge Stories, because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of story that reminds you evidence outlasts intimidation every single time, and if you've ever had someone in your own family try to rewrite the truth right in front of you, I want you to drop a comment and tell me where you were standing when it happened, because trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why I never said a word back to her that day at the funeral home. Daniel and I met at a continuing education conference in Raleigh back when I was 29, working as a financial paralegal, and he was 31, finishing his second year as a civil engineer for a firm that built water treatment systems across 3 counties. He had this quiet, steady way about him, the kind of man who read the fine print on everything, who double-checked contracts before signing them, who taught me more about protecting myself on paper than my own father ever had. We got married in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Asheville 2 years later, and from the very beginning, his mother, Linda Whitman, made it clear that in her eyes, no woman would ever be quite good enough to stand where she had once stood, next to her only son. Linda had raised Daniel alone after his father passed when Daniel was just 14, and I understood, or at least I told myself I understood, that a woman who had fought that hard to keep her son afloat might struggle to let another woman into the picture. What I didn't understand, not for years, was how far she was willing to go to make sure she never actually had to let go. She called constantly in the first year of our marriage, showed up unannounced with grocery bags full of things we didn't ask for, and slowly, carefully, inserted herself into every financial decision Daniel and I tried to make as a couple, always under the banner of just wanting to help her boy get ahead in life. The house on Ridgewood Lane came into the picture in the spring 9 years ago, right around the time my grandmother passed away in Savannah and left me an inheritance of just under $300,000, money that had been sitting in careful, boring investments my whole adult life, waiting for exactly a moment like that one. Daniel and I found the 4-bedroom house through a realtor named Patricia Coyle, a beautiful colonial-style property on almost an acre of land, listed at $540,000, and after some negotiation, we closed at $525,000. Because of the way our finances worked at the time, with Daniel still paying down student loans from his engineering degree and my inheritance sitting liquid and ready, we made the decision together, with our real estate attorney present, to put the deed solely in my name, while Daniel and I both contributed to the mortgage payments from our joint household account for the portion we financed. I want to be very clear here, because this detail becomes the entire foundation of everything that happens later in this story. The deed to that house has always listed one owner, and one owner only, and that owner has always been me, Claire Elizabeth Whitman. Daniel knew this. Our attorney knew this. The title company knew this. It was never a secret, never something hidden or manipulated, simply a practical financial decision made by 2 adults who trusted each other completely. What Linda knew, however, was a very different story, because Daniel, trying to keep the peace the way he always did with his mother, had told her years earlier, in a moment of exhausted diplomacy, that the house was ours, in the general, sentimental sense that a happily married man might say about any shared home, never imagining that his mother would one day treat that offhand comment as a binding legal claim. For 9 years, life on Ridgewood Lane was, by most measures, good. Daniel's career grew steadily. I moved from paralegal work into a compliance role at a regional bank in Charlotte, and Linda remained a constant, if difficult, presence, showing up for holidays with a tight smile for me and open adoration for her son, always finding small ways to remind me that in her mind, this family had a hierarchy, and I was somewhere near the bottom of it. I absorbed most of it quietly, the way you learn to absorb the weather in a place you've decided to live permanently, because I loved Daniel enough to let his mother's coldness roll off me rather than turn every dinner into a battlefield. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March of this year, Daniel collapsed in the garage while loading his truck for a worksite inspection, and by the time the paramedics arrived, the sudden cardiac event that had been hiding silently in his heart for who knows how long had already taken him from me. He was 44 years old. I remember almost nothing about the actual hours that followed, except the sound of my own voice on the phone with the funeral home, sounding like it belonged to someone else entirely, someone calmer and more capable than the woman actually standing in that kitchen. Linda arrived at the hospital before I even had the chance to call her myself, because a neighbor, thinking they were being helpful, had reached her first. From that moment forward, something in her shifted, hardened, took on a kind of cold, calculated energy that I mistook, in my grief, for her own version of mourning. She took over the funeral arrangements almost entirely, choosing the casket, the flowers, the readings, steamrolling every gentle suggestion I made with a firm, practiced tone that left no room for negotiation, and I let her, because I genuinely did not have the strength that week to fight over floral arrangements while my husband's body lay in a funeral home 3 miles from the house we'd built our entire life inside. It was at the visitation, 2 nights before the funeral itself, standing in a receiving line beside a closed casket with Daniel's photo propped beside it, that Linda pulled me aside into a small private room usually reserved for grieving families to compose themselves, and told me, in a voice so calm it took me several seconds to fully absorb what she'd said, that the house on Ridgewood Lane had always been intended for Daniel, that everyone in the family knew it, and that as his mother and closest surviving blood relative, she expected me to have my belongings out by the end of the following month, so that she could, in her words, handle the property the way Daniel would have wanted. I asked her, as gently as I could manage through the fog of that week, what exactly she meant, because the deed had my name on it, solely, and had for 9 years. She reached into her purse, right there in that quiet little room with the box of tissues and the soft lighting meant for grief, not confrontation, and pulled out a folded document, showing me just enough of it to make out a signature line and what appeared to be my name written across it, claiming it was a quitclaim deed I had supposedly signed 4 years earlier, transferring my ownership interest in the property to Daniel alone, which would have made the house, upon his death, pass entirely to his estate, and by extension, given Linda's aggressive interpretation of family loyalty, into her control. I had never seen that document in my life. I had never signed anything transferring ownership of my house to anyone. And in that moment, standing 3 feet from my husband's casket, I understood with a clarity that cut straight through my grief that my mother-in-law was either the victim of an extraordinary scam, or she had just shown me, without meaning to, the opening move of something far more calculated than simple grief-stricken confusion. I didn't argue with her that night. I didn't raise my voice, didn't demand to see the full document, didn't do anything that would give her the satisfaction of watching me unravel in a room built for widows to fall apart in privacy. I simply told her I needed time to think, folded my hands, and walked back out to greet the next person in line, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, because underneath the shock, a very specific memory had already started surfacing, one that Linda had clearly forgotten I still possessed. 3 years before Daniel died, during a particularly tense holiday season where Linda had pushed harder than usual about wanting to help manage our finances as she put it, Daniel and I had sat down with our estate attorney, a careful, precise woman named Renata Osei who had handled our home purchase from the very beginning, and updated our full set of legal documents, our wills, our power of attorney designations, and critically, a formal, notarized affidavit confirming sole ownership of the Ridgewood Lane property in my name, specifically because Daniel had grown uneasy about his mother's escalating comments regarding the house someday belonging to the family properly. At the time, it felt almost excessive, a bit of legal armor against a woman who mostly just made uncomfortable holiday small talk. Sitting in that funeral home 3 years later, it felt like the single smartest decision either of us had ever made. The following morning, still working on almost no sleep, I drove straight to Renata's office before the funeral even took place, carrying nothing but my phone and the raw, focused adrenaline of a woman who suddenly understood she was not just grieving a husband, she was defending her home from the one person who should have been grieving alongside her instead of scheming against her. Renata pulled the file immediately, confirmed everything I already knew, the original deed, the affidavit, Daniel's own notarized statement acknowledging my sole ownership, all of it airtight, all of it dated years before whatever document Linda claimed to be holding. But Renata said something else that morning that I've thought about almost every day since. She said, "Claire, if she's showing you a quitclaim deed with your signature on it that you never signed, that's not a misunderstanding, that's forgery. And if she tries to file it or act on it, we're not just going to correct her, we're going to expose her." The funeral happened the next day, and I stood through every second of it with a composure that surprised even me, because somewhere underneath the grief, a second, colder version of myself had already taken over, methodically planning exactly what needed to happen next. Linda sat 2 rows behind me during the service, dressed in black, accepting condolences like the grieving mother she genuinely was. And I let her have that moment, because whatever fraud she was attempting, whatever twisted grab for control she thought she was making, she had still lost her son, and I understood that grief and greed can occupy the exact same human being at the exact same time. 2 days after the funeral, Linda showed up at the house on Ridgewood Lane unannounced, the way she always had, except this time she brought a folder, a locksmith's business card tucked visibly inside it, and a tone that had shifted from grief into something closer to triumph. She told me she'd already spoken to a real estate agent about listing the property, that she expected me cooperative rather than difficult, and that if I truly cared about honoring Daniel's memory, I would simply accept that the house had never been mine to begin with. I let her speak. I let her finish every single sentence. And then I asked her, calmly, if she would be willing to meet with her attorney and mine together, so that the paperwork on both sides could be reviewed properly, once and for all, before anyone made any decisions about locksmiths or listings. She agreed almost immediately, visibly confident, which told me everything I needed to know about how certain she was that her version of the story would hold up under scrutiny. What she didn't know, because Daniel had kept my updated legal protections mostly private out of respect for my own request for discretion, was that I wasn't walking into that meeting with just a deed and an affidavit. I was walking in with something far more devastating, a recorded phone call from 3 weeks before Daniel's death, one I hadn't even thought much about at the time, in which Linda, frustrated during an argument with Daniel about the house, had said, on speakerphone while I happened to be sitting quietly in the next room folding laundry, that she'd already had someone take care of the paperwork and that Claire would never even notice until it mattered. At the time, exhausted from a long week and used to Linda's dramatic phrasing, I hadn't thought much of it. 3 weeks later, standing in a funeral home holding a forged deed, that sentence replayed in my mind like a confession she hadn't realized she'd already made out loud. The meeting took place 8 days after the funeral, in a conference room at Renata's law office in Uptown Charlotte, with Linda's attorney, a heavy-set older man named Gregory Finch who clearly had no idea what he'd actually agreed to represent, seated across from me. Linda arrived confident, almost smug, laying her copy of the quitclaim deed on the table like it was a winning hand of cards. Renata calmly laid our documents beside it, the original deed, the notarized affidavit, Daniel's own signed acknowledgement, and then, without raising her voice even slightly, introduced a forensic document examiner named Dr. Priya Nair, who had already reviewed both signatures and prepared a formal comparative analysis. Dr. Nair walked the room through it methodically, pointing out the pressure inconsistencies, the pen lifts in places my natural signature never breaks, the subtle tremor patterns that didn't match years of my own verified handwriting samples pulled from bank documents and notarized closing paperwork. She stated plainly, for the record, that in her professional opinion, the signature on Linda's quitclaim deed was not authentic, that it showed clear signs of traced forgery, and that she would testify to that finding under oath if necessary. I watched Linda's face change in real time, the confidence draining out of her as quickly as it had walked in. Then Renata played the recording. Just that one sentence, I already had someone take care of the paperwork, Claire would never even notice until it mattered, filling that quiet conference room with a silence so heavy I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. Gregory Finch turned to his client, and I watched a lifetime of maternal certainty collapse into something small and cornered, sitting in a folding chair, staring at a table covered in the proof of exactly what she had done. I didn't yell. I didn't call her a liar or a thief or any of the words that had been circling my mind for 8 sleepless nights. I simply told her, in the calmest voice I could manage, that I understood grief made people desperate, that I understood losing Daniel had clearly broken something in her that made her willing to forge legal documents against the woman he'd loved for 13 years, but that the house on Ridgewood Lane had always been mine, would remain mine, and that if she ever attempted to file that quitclaim deed with the county recorder's office, or contact another locksmith, or discuss listing that property with any real estate agent again, Renata would be filing forgery and attempted fraud charges with the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office by the end of that same business day. Linda didn't say a word. Gregory Finch quietly gathered his documents, asked for a private moment with his client in the hallway, and roughly 20 minutes later, returned with a signed acknowledgement agreeing to formally withdraw any claim to the property, cease all contact regarding the house, and in exchange for my agreement not to pursue criminal forgery charges immediately, submit to a formal deposition confirming exactly who had helped her produce that forged deed in the first place, because as it turned out, Linda hadn't acted entirely alone. The man who had helped her, a notary named Harold Bellwether operating out of a small strip mall office near Gastonia, was later found to have notarized at least 2 other fraudulent property documents unrelated to my case entirely, and Linda's deposition became one small piece of the evidence that eventually cost him his notary commission and opened him up to his own separate legal exposure. I didn't ask for that outcome. I simply refused to let the lie stand, and the truth, once it started moving, carried its own weight forward without any additional push from me. In the months since, I've stayed in the house on Ridgewood Lane, sitting most evenings on that same wraparound porch where Daniel and I used to drink coffee before work, and I've come to understand something about grief and evidence that I don't think anyone truly explains to you beforehand. Grief makes people vulnerable in ways that predators, even the ones wearing the disguise of a grieving mother, know exactly how to exploit. But evidence, quiet, patient, properly documented evidence, doesn't care how convincing someone's confidence sounds in a funeral home. It simply waits, exactly where you left it, for the moment it's needed most. Linda and I haven't spoken since that meeting, and I've made my peace with the idea that we likely never will again, because some relationships don't survive betrayal, no matter how much shared grief sits underneath them. What I want you to take from this story isn't anger toward a woman who let desperation curdle into fraud, it's a reminder to protect your own paperwork long before you ever think you'll need it, because the version of yourself standing in a funeral home, blindsided and exhausted, is not the version of yourself capable of building an ironclad legal defense from scratch. Build it now, while you're calm, while you're clear-headed, while nobody is testing you yet. If this story meant something to you, I want you to subscribe to Silent Revenge Stories, because these are the kinds of stories I tell every single week: quiet, patient, evidence-driven justice against the people who assume grief will make you too weak to fight back. And before you go, leave a comment telling me the one lesson you're taking from Claire's story tonight, because I read every single one, and I promise you, your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear next.